We're going to talk about the war of the state on all of us and why it is exactly that police are starting to act like the military. To explore this, we're also joined by Liz Fekete from the Institute of Race Relations in an exclusive interview on the concept of paramilitary policing. You may have heard about the release of Mahmoud Khalil, the protest leader at Columbia University in the US, who was snatched, kidnapped, and disappeared by plainclothes officials in the US paramilitary outfit called Immigration and Customs Enforcement. About 4 months ago, plainclothes agents from ICE snatched Mahmoud from his dorms as he was returning from dinner with his 8-month pregnant wife, Noor Khalil. Noor Khalil recorded the harrowing incident, which immediately went global. Mahmoud was flown thousands of miles to a detention facility in Louisiana for organizing pro-Palestine protests at his university. He was forced to share a dorm with 70 other men with no privacy, according to a report by ITV, and was held for over 100 days. Mahmoud Khalil was released after an order by a judge demanded it, but he's not alone. According to Human Rights Watch, the Trump regime has revoked hundreds of student visas. In March, black-hooded ICE agents kidnapped Rumeysa Öztürk, a Turkish Fulbright scholar at Tufts. The woman, visibly hijabi, was accused by the racist regime of supporting Hamas. Her crime, co-authoring a piece demanding Tufts divest from Israel. Others include Lika Kurdia from the West Bank and Ranjani Srinivasani from India. Yanseo Chung, 21, had lived in the US since she was 7. A judge just ruled she can't be deported because of her involvement, not even as an organizer, in a university occupation against the genocide. Mohsin Mahdawi was arrested during an interview finalizing his US citizenship, but was freed immediately after. As it turns out, the Trump regime, which has an unprecedented 13 billionaires within its ranks, has yet to dismantle the entirety of what's left of US liberal democracy. But it is getting there. Now, none of these students have been charged with any crime by this plutocratic regime. The regime has had to invoke a rarely used immigration act that allows the Secretary of State to take away the immigration status of anybody deemed a threat to US foreign policy. And so democracy seems to be dying. And the first, they came for the pro-Palestine protesters. And while you may know about the freedom of Mahmoud Khalil because it's been on the news, do you know about the freedom of Christian Taine? At the time of research, French President Emmanuel Macron had brought key players, political players, from the colony of New Caledonia to Paris in an effort to address discontent on the island. This happened a year after a rebellion against French colonial overreach led to the killing of 14 people and billions of euros in economic damage. The French are organizing talks about the future of the colony because they know they messed around and found out. France, as a colonial power, has governed the archipelago of so-called New Caledonia for over 170 years. Back in 1998, the independence movement compelled France to sign the Nouméa Accord. The accord detailed a roadmap towards political and potential decolonization, with a key clause establishing a restricted electorate for provincial polls. This frozen electoral roll was for the indigenous Kanak people to maintain their sovereignty, having become a slight minority in their own homeland due to decades of French colonial settlement. Then last year, knowing that Kanaki, what the people of New Caledonia call their land, has the 5th largest nickel reserves in the world, and knowing that it also provided France, as a colonial power, reach in the Pacific, knowing all of this, Paris tried to slyly give voting rights to thousands of non-indigenous residents, mainly white wealthy French residents on retirement, in contravention to the Nouméa Accord. And they thought that they could get away with this, until the youth rose up. Last year's rebellion forced democratic France to not only send the gendarmerie, but even to ban TikTok on the island as their war crimes were being live-streamed. Kanaki became a zone of exception, and police were allowed to run wild. Democracy was basically suspended. In a video that went viral on the island, French paramilitary forces were seen kicking a handcuffed protester immobilized on the floor in the head until he went unconscious. French forces also needed an excuse. And so, as if to provoke the Kanak people even further, the French imagined up a conspiracy theory that the main organizations that make up the pro-independence movement in New Caledonia, groups like the Kanak and Socialist National Liberation Front, the New Caledonian Union, and the Field Action Coordination Cell, well, the French were saying that they went and orchestrated this rebellion in some kind of secret room. Now, this is, of course, silly. As Rosa Luxemburg taught us over a century ago, revolutions do not allow anyone to play the schoolmaster. Yet, one of the organizations, the Field Action Coordination Cell, was even accused of being a mafia kind of organization that was attempting to orchestrate an, open quote, armed rebellion, something out of a French novel. All allegations obviously couldn't be proven in court. Christian Taine and 10 other so-called ringleaders of the anti-colonial rebellion were then put on a plane ride of 17,000 miles for 25 hours by the empire to stand trial in France. And yes, that's how far France's colony of Kanaki actually is from mainland France. Their actual crime, demanding an independent republic. Now, let's be clear, this was an anti-establishment rebellion, not ordered by anybody and against the entire ruling class, including even that wing which might prefer autonomy or even independence over colonial rule. This was also an indigenous rebellion against an alien colonial regime thousands of miles away, which was trying to undermine the Kanak struggle for independence. Now, if anything, this proves that they might be able to arrest figureheads of the anti-colonial movement, but the empires of the world can't defeat it. We have partial wins so long as republican institutions still exist, but the institutions of our ideal republic are being torn down by the fascists. And it is black and brown people, as well as racialized people more generally, who are the first to feel the brunt of imperial violence. But this is the fate not just of black and brown people, but all of you, all of us, the elite, the white nationalists, don't have answers to structural crises. And they treat us as those they want off this sinking ship, which we call austerity England, and many countries which are reeling with austerity. This is happening all across Europe. In fact, ethno-nationalism is growing all around the world. Instead of addressing the inordinate power of the plutocrats, who sees the imperial machinery of many states, they come after us. And they try to buy your consent, because they know that this is unsustainable. Nobody can afford rent. The cost of groceries is getting higher. The amount of people permanently unemployed, the surplus population, is getting larger. The planet is getting hotter. The rich are getting richer. Wars are happening everywhere, and the rich know that if this continues, democracy will be an inconvenience. They can only rule through violence. So now is practice time. And as Amy Césaire taught us, they come for the colonized first, but then they use these techniques on you and on all of us. Let me explain the playbook. First, they distract us with a culture war and fan the flames of division, even if that leads to racist street riots. Then next, they wrap up moral panics that will help make protests criminal. As we're speaking, a bill is being considered that will make it illegal in England to wear masks in a protest. Finally, they practice state violence on the most vulnerable. Those are the bodies that are used for practice. If the state has got new weapons, particularly the types used against entire crowds, what the state euphemistically calls non-lethal weapons, they are encouraged to use them. Their philosophy is as thus. See what happens when you go after the benefits of the disabled, the rights of trans women, when you murder migrants who are seeking safe passage and the right to asylum. What can you get away with? And can you go further? Can you go after the environmental protesters and the anti-colonial protests? Can you get the state to declare them as terrorists, especially those who might engage in property damage that might hurt the profits of capitalists? What happens when you blur the lines between the military and the police? What happens when you let the army police protests and the police become the army? There's all sorts of experiments going on worldwide. Add to this the funding of white nationalists to make podcasts and TV stations and get people to hate their neighbors. And most importantly, removing all of the democratic inhibitions that have prevented police so far from appearing as straight-up stormtroopers. This is the rentier elite who make their money without providing much to society. Yes, they are doing everything they can to destroy the institutions of democracy, and they do it in the name of free speech. They do it in the name of democracy. Do you want an example of this absurdity? In declaring the formation of the Trump regime's task force to confront anti-Semitism, a government body made up of cabinet secretaries, a former Fox News contributor, and a private equity investor, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said that this was necessary because, open quote, in recent years, the censorship and false narratives of woke cancel culture have transformed our great universities into greenhouses for this deadly and virulent pestilence, close quote. And what does this task force do? Well, it basically pulls millions in federal funding from big universities like Columbia and Harvard unless they fulfill the requirements of the Trump government's ideology tests, in the name, of course, of academic freedom. So concerned about woke cancel culture, they have decided to cancel federal funding from universities if they don't prevent their students from organizing for Palestine. Now, folks, this is the dress rehearsal for fascism. They are telling you what you can and can't believe, and they will deport you or even revoke your citizenship if you can't prove your loyalty and ideological conformity to their so-called anti-woke agenda. England isn't too far off. The High Court has just rejected Palestine Action's last-minute legal bid to postpone its ban, meaning that the group has been officially prescribed under the Terrorist Act. Consequently, being a member of the group or showing support for it has become a criminal offense, carrying a potential 14-year prison sentence. The ban was triggered by Palestine Action's sustained campaign against arms companies complicit in genocide in Gaza, which culminated in activists infiltrating RAF Bryce Norton in June 2025 and spray painting 2 military aircrafts. This led Emperor Home Secretary Yvette Cooper to unilaterally prescribe Palestine Action as a terrorist organization. At the same time, the focus of the world has shifted to Glastonbury, where the punk duo Bob Vylan led the crowd in a chant of "Death, death to the IDF," which was broadcast live by the BBC. They were chanting not against civilians, but an army that many human rights organizations are saying is committing genocide in Gaza, in Palestine. But the anti-woke agenda has come with a vengeance. All of the major political parties rushed to condemn Bob Vylan. The BBC also was condemned for having televised them. And this has led to a police investigation, the cancellation of their US tour after their visas were revoked, and being dropped by their booking agent, United Talent Agency. Their crime was to chant "Death, death to the IDF," and not death to black people maybe in the neighboring postcode, because that would obviously be freedom of speech. That would be gangster rap. So you can rap "Death, death to the ops," but never "Death, death to the IDF. And you can have an arrest warrant released by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and get a standing ovation in the US Senate. Yes, I'm talking about Netanyahu. But you can't rap "Death to the IDF," because that's not freedom of speech. That's woke. In fact, the system is suddenly calling everyone a terrorist. The band Bob Vylan opening for the Irish Kneecap, well, their bassist has also been declared an enemy of the state. And so you may be asking yourself, where are the anti-woke free speech warriors? Well, maybe they're in on this repression too, aren't they? I won't name names. You probably know the names of the free speech industrial complex. All of these people who have been cancelled only to win lucrative careers and book tours and news bookings because of their cancellation. In fact, if you want to get rich in the global north today, get yourself quote unquote cancelled. But more importantly, maybe you should even echo a fascist when you do it. But don't get cancelled for, I don't know, standing against genocide, because that is when your career is at risk. If you want to be defended by the free speech warriors, you'd have to Sig Heil or develop the ideological foundations for fascist terrorism to get their support. Talk about the great replacement or something. Otherwise, you're woke. Otherwise, you deserve it. And you should get hit by water cannons And you should choke on tear gas in protests. And you should be cancelled for saying free Palestine. And you should be deported. And your visa should be revoked too. You should be kidnapped for having the wrong opinions because you don't deserve free speech. Because you see, there's a calculated attempt to deprive those of us resisting, or even those of us whose existence terrifies the system, those of us who have been made surplus by the system, those of us of the global majority, those of us who might not have millions in generational wealth. There's a network of people who are trying to strip everything from us. This is an alliance of billionaires and millionaires, an alliance including the far right. Even centrist politicians who are trying to outflank the far right by trying to win the far right vote and mimicking the far right. Companies are making a killing too. Contractors and arms companies, figuratively and literally. The bigger context here is that the system is broken because they don't have answers. And so they answer not with welfare and root causes, but warfare. A war on terror where anybody can be a terrorist. A war on trans people because they know that trans people are vulnerable in society. And now demands for remigration because that is the new pet project. There's a new project to deport millions of us who are of non-white descent. And by the way, I don't just mean newly arrived migrants, but even those of us whose parents or grandparents came here. This is being discussed everywhere, from a secret meeting between neo-Nazis and the AfD and the ruling party CDU in Germany, to even apparently some conversations in the House of Lords in Britain. And they have no answers, so they come after us. And this is part of a broader multicultural war on the multicultural working class. Here in Britain, entire neighborhoods are occupied for the testing of surveillance gear, for the testing of predictive policing and new AI technologies in so-called crime hotspots, which are mainly black and brown neighborhoods. And they use so-called non-lethal weapons that kill. And this is why we have to place anti-Palestinian racism within a broader context. Here in England, they knocked a 71-year-old woman who was a legal observer in Palestine protest unconscious. In France, a Maghrebi woman who was over the age of 80 years old was killed by a tear gas canister in her home amid protests against racist police brutality that were happening just outside of her home. In Germany, they arrested a 10-year-old boy for waving a Palestinian flag. We're besieged by fascist gangs, by police forces, by a hostile mainstream media, by a bought and paid for so-called alternative media, pushing a war on woke as a Trojan horse to justify what they want to do to us. And that's because they don't have the answers. And the only way we defeat this is if all decent people come together and struggle from below. That's why we're joined by Liz Fekete today. Liz is here representing the Institute for Race Relations and their latest report on paramilitary policing. The study focuses on the experiences of migrants and refugees, pro-Palestinian demonstrators, Black Lives Matter supporters, and those injured by so-called less lethal weaponry during civil unrest. And it shows how this is related to colonialism. Thanks so much for joining us, Liz. So one of the things that came up in the report was you talked about the myth of less lethal weapons, that less lethal weapons actually kill. But it's kind of like a marketing term, isn't it? So can you tell me a little bit about what less lethal weapons actually are, and why the state's kind of using them in these days against various different types of people, migrants, protesters, etc.?
The term less lethal weapons is a state term. It's a term used in police manuals. It's a term used by nation states. It's not a term I think that people like us would use, or people who've experienced the impact of these weapons. The state uses that term to distinguish them from lethal weapons like guns. And actually, I think if we sort of rolled back, we'd probably see that this is actually a response to Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the right to life, by branding them as less lethal weapons. And the same sort of manufacturers who make lethal weapons, make these weapons, the state can say we are protecting the right to life, but actually these weapons kill. Another term that is often used is crowd control weaponry. So what do we mean when we talk about, or what does the state mean when they talk about less lethal weapons? They mean things like plastic and rubber bullets. They mean things like tear gas. You mentioned the case of Zineb Redouane in France. She died because she was hit by a tear gas canister, a tear gas grenade. People sometimes think it's just the spray, but it's also the grenade that is launched from what are actually rocket launchers. It refers to batons, which police might use in riot control situations and hit people over the head with those batons, also cause injuries and deaths. And it can refer to tasers, pepper spray, electric shock weapons, all those sorts of things. In the report, we try not to use the term less lethal weapons, for a number of reasons, but primarily because those who have endured its impact, or those who are the families of people who have died, really don't like using that term. And we take our lead from Relatives for Justice, which is an organisation in Northern Ireland that was formed to represent the families of people killed by plastic or rubber bullets during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And they feel very, very strongly that any use of any term in relation to a plastic bullet that takes away from the fact that is a bullet is actually doing a disservice, because it is actually obscuring the lethal impact of this weaponry. And also the fact is that these weapons have a net widening effect. As soon as the police feel that they can use these weapons, it means that they're using them in more and more situations. They're using them in situations where force is absolutely not necessary.
Would an example of that be, for example, the BLM protests in the US in 2020?
Yeah, BLM protests in the US in 2020, but also in Europe, where tear gas, water cannon was used against BLM, and most recently, it's mushroomed. It's got much bigger in terms of the Palestine solidarity movement and anti-genocide protesters, where we've seen a whole range of weapons in Europe: tear gas, water cannon, mounted charges of horses, and also, I mean, in one incident that upset me very, very much in the Netherlands, of all places, where bulldozers were brought in to break up a student encampment. And obviously that just reminded me of Rachel Corrie. I found it really offensive.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about Northern Ireland a bit as well. And obviously the history of colonial violence in Northern Ireland involved paramilitary outfits. And even all across Ireland, from the Black and Tans in the early 20th century to the Ulster Royal Constabulary Force. But when you write about paramilitary policing in this report, you're not referring to the kind of the outsourcing of the state's violence to these little gangs that run around and terrorize colonized people. What do you mean by the term paramilitary policing?
Paramilitary policing in the report refers to the use of specialist units that are modelled around a military model but still exist within the command structure of the police. We've had a long history in this country. I mean, I'm quite a bit older than you, Mohamed, and I first cut my teeth in the 1980s. And this was when we first began to have a special patrol group, which actually was modelled on the RUC in Northern Ireland. So, those colonial connections are kind of almost like embedded in the way that I understand things. So that's what we mean by paramilitary policing. But in the report, we use it interchangeably with another term, which is hyper-militarised policing. I would say that the growth of these specialist units are a symptom of a bigger trend, which is hyper-militarised policing, and that's the blurring of the lines between the police and the military. I mean, we can see that just visually in our own experience when we see so many police units and the officers begin to look like the military in terms of the gear that they're kitted out with. And we also link it back to another concept, which is territorial policing, which is quite literally the policing of territory. You've already talked about that in terms of hot crime spots where police a small piece of territory very intensively through saturation policing, through excessive handcuffing, through stop and search, suspicionless stop and search, and through immigration enforcement. Another example of territorial policing.
Could you say that there's certain people who are so vulnerable to this kind of violence that you use this term called a zone of exception, where the state creates a space where the rules don't matter? You mentioned like the right to life. Nothing matters really. Like they're just they can just go wild and kill people. And especially we've seen this with migrants, for example, in the English Channel. Can you tell me a little bit and maybe tell us a little bit more about what the concept of a zone of exception is?
Yeah, the zone of exception is actually a term used by various governments in Europe to justify the suspension of a rule of law, or the ordinary rule of law, in border zones. So Spain uses zones of exception, its North African enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. Hungary has used it. Poland has used it at the border with Belarus. So it literally means, and I think the colonial connotations that you've already talked about are very interesting here, it means the suspension of the rule of law, and it means that in particular areas, people's civil and human rights can be relinquished. And obviously there's a continuity there with colonialism, because colonial policing was always much more on a military model with zones of exception.
Yeah. And, zones of exception, they're not just in, for example, buffer zones in between borders, right? There was one specifically harrowing case that you brought up in the report, which happened late last year. And that was of the Haringey Kurdish Community Centre. The state had declared that people in there had the wrong sorts of ideas. And then they sent out police dogs, huge amounts of police in riot gear. There also was coordinated campaigns in the homes of some of these activists, and including older people who had escaped political persecution in Turkey. They closed the airspace. It was almost as if Tottenham was a war zone. Haringey was a war zone. Would that be a zone of exception, would you say?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sort of pointing that out. Yes, I think obviously within counter-terrorism policing, there is a rationale for, just within counter-terrorism policing and within the laws, there is a rationale. These are exceptional measures. This is justified in terms of that there is a state of emergency threatening the life of a nation. What is incredibly important in terms of the raid on the Haringey Kurdish Community Centre is the Metropolitan Police actually said there was no imminent threat to London. Yeah. And we've actually put in a Freedom of Information request to actually find out how much money was spent on this operation where there was no threat to London. So yeah, the whole point, I think, with once you establish a state of exception in one area is that it can be rolled out in another area. And I think this is why what happens to people on the move at external borders is so important, because it's often a testing ground for measures that can be rolled out to other people. And I just want to say here that I think what is particularly upsetting at the moment is what is happening in places like Calais and Dunkirk, where the French police, under pressure of the Home Secretary, is firing tear gas into the water as people enter into boats. This is extremely dangerous, and it is particularly dangerous for children because tear gas tends to impact at lower levels, and it can actually affect their lungs, and it is a threat to their life. And I think that the reckless nature of the pursuit of this weaponry against people on the move is really, really worrying. And it goes back, I think, again to the colonial continuum, because there is this kind of thinking that people from the global south should just endure pain and should just endure suffering. Therefore, we can experiment with them on the use of this weaponry.
Yeah. I wanted to know more about the political and economic reasons for this, right? I mean, there's obviously demand by certain sections of the far right, but unfortunately, like right-wing populism is growing. Despite all these horrifying things you're telling us, it's not enough. And one of the things that you talk about in the report is that actually there's something else that's happening. This is a context where, because the state is not capable of providing welfare, it's now moving and turning itself into a warfare state to just deal with the people who otherwise should be getting the welfare. So can you explain about some of the political and economic rationale behind the rise of paramilitary policing? Yeah. Not just by like right-wing governments, but even like ostensibly left-wing or left governments as well.
Yeah, definitely. Happy to talk about that. But first of all, can I say that the far-right parties should be careful what they wish for? Because, I mean, we've seen in Northern Ireland during the recent attempt of a racist pogrom, which were actually orchestrated by loyalist paramilitaries with far-right connections, that plastic bullets were fired, including at children and teenagers during those riots. And we're against the use of plastic bullets in any situation. So to go back to your question, I think this all goes back to the idea of surplus populations. So there is an economic rationale for this in the sense that we've had decades of austerity. We've had major restructuring of labour forces. And I think in policy circles and in state circles, there is a belief that certain sections of the multicultural working class are surplus to labour requirements, or they're precarious workers, or they're hustling in alternative economies. So in a sense, they're what people might refer to as an outcast proletariat, or in Victorian times would have been talked about as the unproductive residuum. So I feel that what is happening is that states and politicians are increasingly living in a securitized bubble. Talk about parallel societies. The rich and people with wealth, and also the politicians who don't have to engage with people anymore. I mean, what we used to see in terms of elections with the hustings and, literally people giving speeches on sort of soapboxes, this doesn't happen anymore. People are driven to the television studio where they may give their message to the people there. So they do not want to be contaminated by surplus populations. I think this is why we have such a growth in CCTV. It's to contain these populations who are also sort of subjected to internal bordering as states increasingly sift populations between populations who are entitled to rights and people who are considered risks. So this is the economic rationale for what is happening. And I think we see it in terms of, the right to protest, the attack on the right to protest, because politicians, particularly we've seen this in terms of Gaza and the genocide, they really do not want to be faced by a population who are angry and asking them questions about why the British state is complicit with the genocide. And this is another reason why they want to be inured from that population, so they don't have to see them or hear them.
Yeah. And, surplus populations, generally speaking, means those populations which are not like temporarily unemployed that you might use as strike breakers when there's a strike or something. These are people who are permanently unemployed, completely been made redundant by the economic system, and this is everywhere. It's a category that expands everywhere from migrants who have been basically forced into a situation where they risk their lives and they're surplus, so you can do what you want with them. But even to people in, neighborhoods across England which are seen as like, layabouts, unemployed, so we can do whatever we want to them as well. But you just touched on something in the end there, because people don't want to do that. People deserve the right to a life, a decent life. And so people will organize. People see people like them being killed in genocides. People organize. But we're seeing increasingly, what you call in the report, an undeclared war on social movements, which also can be used, which we can see very clearly, for example, in the criminalisation of protests in support of Palestine. Can you tell us a little bit more about this, like undeclared, and specifically the focus on the undeclared part of the war on social movements?
Yeah, I think the undeclared aspect of it is, if you listen to politicians, they will all make statements about how they support civil liberties and they support the right to protest. And at the same time, they are saying nothing when it comes to particular techniques of the police to limit the right to protest. And I'm thinking here of things like protest zoning, which we've seen particularly in relation to protests around Palestine solidarity. So protest zoning refers to a technique that actually has been developing ever since the anti-globalization movement of the late 1990s, where certain areas of the city are declared out of zone for protesters. So, and I think during the whole anti-genocide movement, we've seen this increase. So usually, protest zoning, we saw that during the BLM protests in Europe, might be sort of, royal palaces. In Sweden, it was around the sort of, where the king and the queen lived, etc. But in terms of Palestine solidarity, it's moved from certain areas of the city, like Parliament, to even the BBC and to the university. So in more and more sort of restrictions on where people are allowed to gather and assemble. But there's a wider process behind that, which is called protest stigmatization, which politicians play a huge role in. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily useful to just blame the police for this. These are political decisions. These are decisions of politicians. So when you have politicians forever stigmatizing certain social movements as disruptive, as an irritant, as the whole Palestine solidarity movement was, depicted as a hate crime movement. Yeah. This is a deliberate use of stigmatization processes to contain political movements. And this is what we refer to as political policing.
Absolutely. And the thing about political policing, though, is it's transnational, right? I mean, it's not just happening in England. It's people are getting their visas cancelled in England, student visas, for example, cancelled, but they're getting their visas cancelled in the US. Even Germany is engaging in deportations, which is, considering Germany's history, it's just awful. It's disgusting. Yeah. But that doesn't change the fact that because they're operating transnationally and they're sharing their ways of policing social movements, it means that our movements are also operating transnationally and that there are cross-border connections between our movements from below. So can you tell me more about, like, for example, groups like Black Lives Matter or, the pro-Palestinian liberation movement, for example? Is there a way to challenge, this paramilitary policing complex that you're talking about, which is global?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in the United States that the movement for Black Lives and the Black Lives Matter movement have been so intensely aware of the connections between Palestine and the suppression of the Black Lives Matter movement because of exactly what you've said, is the relationship between Israel and the US and the Israeli military doctrine and the US military doctrine. And I think that it's quite clear that the whole movement for Palestine solidarity is a movement of the global majority, and it's been extremely inspiring that the international movement in support of the people of Palestine, and it's clearly shown us that we cannot be nativists ourselves. We cannot be narrow-minded. We can't be just look at what's happening in Britain. We can't be Eurocentric. We have to be part of an international movement. That is where we gain our strength from.
Thank you so much, Liz, for this incredible interview and just the amazing report, and also that call to action that, joining social movements right now isn't just a struggle for solidarity with Palestine or for for Black life, but it's also the last bulwark of democracy, isn't it? So, thank you so much. And that's it for this edition of Decolonial Dispatch. Please do remember that decolonization is not a metaphor, so get involved. If you want to know more about what the Decolonial Centre does, feel free to look in the description of this video. You'll find a link to our newsletter. And if this report was valuable to you, please do share it with your networks. We'll soon be launching a supporters network, and so becoming a supporter would help us create this kind of content and make it free for everyone. So we really do appreciate that. I am Mohamed Elnaiem. This is Decolonial Dispatch, and I'll see you next time.